Bean was looking out the window. It was the first chance he'd had to relax and play tourist since arriving at the moon more than 2 days earlier. He thought about how strange that it felt to orbit the moon. The strangest thing about it was the silence. There wasn't any engine noise the way there always was in a plane. And it felt odd to see the spacecraft fly in the same direction no matter how it was pointed. Orbiting the moon, Bean thought, was much more of a science fiction experience than walking on it had been. Flying in space was better than Bean had ever imagined during those long years as a rookie. Yesterday, during the rendezvous, he'd been slaving away with the backup computer and the navigation charts while Conrad flew the lunar module. They had one more burn to do, and then they would have it made. Conrad said to him, "Why don't you just quit after this mid-course and relax and enjoy it? You can take a minute and fly this vehicle." Startled by Pete's audacity, Bean wondered, wouldn't it put them off course? No, Conrad assured him. Whatever digressions they made would be easy to correct. Bean was reluctant. Surely Mission Control would know. Conrad laughed. Not on the backside of the moon, they won't. Bean realized that Conrad had planned this perfectly, and for a few moments Bean had his hand at the crisp, responsive ascent stage. It was a moment that Bean would always remember as pure Pete Conrad, that in a small craft somewhere over the far side of the moon, he had taken the time to share with Bean a flying experience that even most astronauts would never know. And then Bean could see Yankee Clipper out ahead, growing softly from a point of light into a gleaming spacecraft. He watched as the command module moved from sunlight into shadow and back again, thinking, that looks so neat. Dick Gordon did a perfect job on the docking, smooth as glass. And later, when he opened the tunnel to the limb, all he could see was two dim figures floating in a cloud of dust. He called down, "You guys ain't gonna mess up my nice clean spacecraft." Before he would even let them into the command module, he made them take off their filthy suits. They passed them up through the tunnel, and Gordon hurriedly zipped them into their stowage bags underneath the couches. Finally, when he and Conrad got up there, Gordon was happier than Bean had ever seen him. He was scurrying around, helping them stow their gear. He was offering them a drink of water, and in that moment, Bean was filled with a love for his crewmates that he had never experienced. Years later, Bean would say his most special memories of the flight would not be about the moon or the earth. They would be about Pete Conrad and Dick Gordon. Now Bean looked out at the bright, bleak cinder passing beyond his window. It was so utterly inhospitable. Everything in the universe has some function, Bean thought. But what is the function of the moon? Is it to make the tides? The earth would probably get along fine without them. Maybe it was as the geologist said, the moon is here to tell us the story that had been lost forever on our own planet. Maybe the moon would tell us where we came from. Bean didn't know the answer. As Yankee Clipper circled, Bean looked now and then. He wondered. He found himself thinking about the 6-year journey that had gotten him here. He realized now, with his neck farther out than it had ever been, that life is too precious to spend it living by someone else's rules, even the unwritten ones of the astronaut office. He would be a good astronaut, but he would do it his way. As the moon bore silent witness, he told himself, when I get back home, if I get back home, I'm going to live my life the way that I want to. Pete Conrad wasn't feeling well. For one thing, he had somehow managed to come down with a cold. How did I get the world's greatest cold on the moon, for Christ's sakes? Bean answered. Because you had the world's greatest LMP with you on the moon, who had a cold. Where Bean's cold had come from, he had no idea. Then there was the rash on Conrad's chest. He'd had a reaction to something in the adhesive that stuck the biomedical sensors to his skin, and it raised itchy welts like a bad case of poison ivy. It was almost the best moment of the flight when Houston finally told him he could take them off. Bean was out of it too, or at least it seemed that way to Conrad and Gordon. He was spending much of his time on the way back to Earth, sacked out in his sleeping bag. Not surprising, he'd peaked for the landing and the moonwalks, and the trip home was definitely an anticlimax. A couple of days ago, Conrad would have been happy to fire up the SPS engine longer than the flight plan had called for and come barreling out of lunar orbit so fast that they would trim a day off the return. But Houston wasn't about to let them do that. There was plenty of time to think on the way back, and Conrad did. He was proud of Apollo 12. They'd proven the pinpoint landing capability and accomplished their other objectives. Now astronauts could go to the places the scientists wanted them to. But along with the immense feelings of elation and satisfaction, there was something else, something Conrad had not expected. After 7 years of eating, sleeping, breathing Apollo, he had finally had his mission, and it had been perfect. And now, just like that, it was all over. The flying had been brief but challenging. The sights had been the most spectacular of his life. And yet going to the moon wasn't what Conrad had expected. Yes, it was spectacular, but it wasn't momentous. Looking back on it now, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had been so much like the training that it was almost anticlimactic. Take away the weightlessness and the view, and he might as well have been in the simulator. 7 years ago, he had told himself that if he made it to the moon, he wouldn't let it change him. Now he had no worries that it would. Conrad kept these thoughts to himself as Yankee Clipper headed home. And he had no idea whether his crewmates felt the same way. He was quite surprised when Albine turned to him and said, as if he could read his mind, "It's kind of like the song. Is that all there is?" Sometime after he and Dick Gordon and Albine got out of quarantine, Pete Conrad got his crew together for a survival meeting of sorts. It was time to talk about their futures. For his own part, Conrad had not known how he might feel about the moon after the flight. But now that he was home, he already knew he wanted to go back. It was a spectacular place, and he had proved to himself that it was also a fine workplace. Before the flight, he'd always daydreamed that he and Gordon and Bean would each return to the moon as commanders of their own missions. Gordon would land on Apollo 18, Bean on 19, and himself on 20. There had been talk about bringing along a one-man lunar flyer for those last 2 missions, to expand the range of an astronaut in search of discoveries. In his daydreams, he and Bean would develop the flyer and then test it out on their missions.